So now we're going to look at some things that are unseen. Now, these are things that we kind of take for granted now. And these are things that were entirely unknown in ancient times. For example, think about the feelings that this word invokes for you. Okay, ready? Quarantine, right? I mean, does that give you like a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling? 5 years ago, like we never talked about quarantine. We didn't know what quarantine was. Now we've all got quarantine anxiety, right? Because we went through a time in a period where we said we have to quarantine. Why do we quarantine? We wanted to quarantine for the safety of ourselves and the safety of others and all that stuff. I'm going to stay away so I don't get somebody else sick. Don't we just love that word quarantine? We still get anxious about it, but why do we do that? We did it because it was based on our understanding of germs. We said, if I'm sick, I don't want to be too close to you because I will get you sick if we're too close, right? So we had this idea of quarantining. Now quarantining, according to the CDC, whom we all love and respect, I'm sure, according to the CDC, they said that quarantining began in Venice in the 14th century. That's when the first historical records of quarantining was in the 14th century, about 600 years ago, a little more than 600 years ago. In Venice, that's when quarantining kind of began as we know it. And then after continued outbreaks of the yellow fever in 1878, so about 140 years ago, something like that, Congress passed a federal quarantine legislation, basically saying that if there's an outbreak of something, they can come and they can tell you to quarantine, which we've all had the luxury of experiencing over the last couple of years. This quarantine idea, which says, I'm going to stay away so that I don't get sick or I'm not going to get anybody else sick. Look what it says here in Numbers. The Lord gave these instructions to Moses. Command the people of Israel to remove from the camp anyone who has a skin disease or a discharge or has become ceremonially unclean by touching a dead person. He's basically saying, okay, you need to quarantine. If anybody's sick here, you need to put them on the outside of the town because it will spread and it will wipe you all out. And then it's interesting here about, talking about ceremonially unclean by touching a dead person. I'm just going to take a little side note here for just a moment, okay? Because I find this particularly fascinating. Like we have this idea, like if you touch a dead body, like you'd probably want to like wash your hands afterwards. Burn your clothes, everything. It's like we have an idea that that's probably not the most sanitary thing in the world, right? But not too long ago, this was not a commonly known fact. In fact, in the 1840s, there was a scientist and a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, and he was the first person to start to discover and explore these infant fevers that were breaking out in hospitals in Austria. In fact, in one particular hospital, the infant mortality rate was 10%. That means 1 in every 10 infants was dying from fever in the hospital. In fact, some women, instead, they were so afraid to go to the hospital, they would have their baby outside in the streets and alleyways, and their babies would have a better chance of successfully living out there than they would in the hospital. It was a 1 in 10 chance. So this really bothered this doctor. And as he began to examine it and discover it, he realized something. He made a connection that had never been made before. And it was that some of the doctors were working with cadavers or dead people. They were working with cadavers, going from them and going over and delivering babies, never washing their hands in between. And these babies would get sick, and 1 out of every 10 of them would die. So he instituted a system, and he said, after you touch a dead body, I want you to wash your hands in the solution and then go over there and then deliver the baby. The infant mortality rate in that hospital in 1 year went from 10% down to 0% because they instituted washing hands. Like, wow, this guy Ignaz was a hero, right? No, guess what? He was totally ridiculed by the medical industry. By everyone, they ridiculed him. In fact, it went so far, he lost his job over this. They committed him to an insane asylum. And in the last days of his life, they had him in a straitjacket. They beat him and they left him there to die because what he was saying was going against the establishment. And yet, right here, says that you're ceremonially unclean after touching a dead body. Goes on to say, verse 3, the command applies to men and women alike. Remove them so they will not defile the camp in which I live among them. So the Israelites did as the Lord had commanded Moses and removed such people from the camp. So for thousands of years, we could only see what our eyes could see. We could only see what our eyes could see. We couldn't see any further than our eyes could see, and we couldn't see any closer than our eyes could see. It wasn't until 1590 that Zacharias Jansen invented something that we now know as the microscope, and it opened up an entire unseen world. Now, they didn't really know what to do with it, but they just knew they could see things a lot better that were small. 90 years later, a man named Antony van Leeuwenhoek was the father of microbiology. 90 years later, this guy, Antony, he takes the microscope and he develops it even further. They call him the father of microbiology because he discovered things like the red blood cells and protozoa and bacteria. He would take pond water, which they thought had absolutely nothing in it, and when he would look at it under a microscope, he'd see that there was so much life in it, he couldn't even believe it. They discovered things like weevils, an insect, weevils, that they didn't actually spontaneously come to life out of grain. They also realized that fleas and shellfish did not spontaneously come to life out of the sand. They thought if you have sand there, well then sand fleas would just appear out of nothing. But he realized that they had a reproductive cycle just like any other of the known species. So he would discover these things. Now, everything now that we see, they say, is just a small sliver of life because there's so much life that we can't even see. In the microscopic world, most of life is invisible. Every major organism, so like us and animals and all of these things, I know this is a little bit gross, but every organism is covered on the inside and out with bacteria. We're covered with it. We're covered with living organisms. In fact, you wouldn't be alive without it. Some of us are getting a little, crawly just thinking about all of the organisms that are on us possibly. We wouldn't be alive without it. But just as it is critical to life, it could also be the cause of sickness and death. Right? Bacteria and germs and pathogens and parasites, all of these things. And we didn't know this until relatively recently. But guess what? God did. God knew of this all along. In your notes, following God's law protected the ancient Jews from the harmful effects of bacteria. This is why, if you've ever read the book of Leviticus, it gets really, really boring because you see all this stuff about how to treat skin diseases and how to clean your clothing and how to scrub the walls of your house and how to clean your bowls and your dishes and how to clean all of these things. And it's like, what is the point of all this? God was teaching them how to stay sanitary. He was teaching them these things. Do you know that certain types of meat and animals that carry higher quantities of unhealthy bacteria and parasites? This is why when we think of kosher food, like most Jews, even many of the Jews to this day won't eat pork, right? Like that's one that we kind of know about, that they won't eat pork. I mean, we see this right here in Deuteronomy 14:8. It says, and you may not eat the pig. It has split hooves, but does not chew the cud, so it's ceremonially unclean for you. So you may not eat the meat of these animals or touch their carcasses. Remember, we're touching the dead things because, again, the bacteria transmissions. And it wasn't just pork, but we know that pork carries, trichinosis, or a parasite. But not just pork, there was also, vultures and owls and winged insects that could walk, okay? Not winged insects that could jump. So a grasshopper, you can eat as many grasshoppers as you want, but the housefly, don't eat it. And who would want to eat that? Because we know the houseflies, they can carry all kinds of sickness, but they didn't know that back then. And you also couldn't eat rats, and you couldn't eat lizards, and you couldn't eat fish with no scales. Even, guess what? You couldn't eat bats either, right? I was listening. I'm like, hey, maybe we could have spared ourselves this whole pandemic. Had somebody been reading, scripture here, not eating these things. In your notes, the amount of accurate wisdom and insight in the Bible is honestly, it's beyond comprehension. We can't even comprehend all of the insight. We can look at it, we can begin to kind of piece together bits and pieces of the whys and all this stuff. But God didn't always explain his reasoning, and it's now that we're starting to say, oh, maybe this is why he didn't want us eating bats and he didn't want us eating things. Or how about shellfish? Anybody like shellfish, lobster, clams, crabs? Some of you guys like it? Okay. I like it, but these were all forbidden, right? You couldn't eat them. You couldn't eat lobster and clams and mussels and crabs. You couldn't eat all that because they're all bottom feeders. They're all the garbage disposal system of the ocean. You couldn't do that. You couldn't even touch their dead bodies. So if you saw a crab laying on the beach, you couldn't go over and touch it. We know now that lobsters and shellfish have harmful bacteria that are present at all times in their flesh. And once a lobster, for example, dies, the bacteria can rapidly multiply and release toxins that may not be destroyed if you cook the lobster, which is why you minimize the chance by cooking the lobster alive. This is why we put them in there alive and it kills them. And we're like, oh, I feel so horrible, but I really want lobster, Maybe I hire somebody else to do it for me. But this is why if it's dead, they say don't eat it if it's dead, because the toxins that they can release in there. Now, also, it goes on to say in the Bible that if the animal, if it dies on fabric or leather, things like that, you're supposed to soak it and you're supposed to put it outside, let it quarantine so that it can sanitize. If it dies in a clay pot, however, look what it says here in Leviticus 11:33. If such an animal falls into a clay pot, everything in the pot will be defiled and the pot must be smashed. Now, they didn't explain it, but we know now that all the pockets inside of the pottery of a clay pot can actually harbor bacteria for a very, very long time. So they just have to smash the pot. And it says, even if the water from such a container spills on any food, the food will be defiled, and any beverage in such a container will be defiled. And again, if you know anything about food safety, you're like, yeah, that makes logical sense. If there was like a dead, rat in a thing of water, I'm not gonna drink that. We're not gonna make a soup out of that. We're not gonna use that because we know it's defiled. But back then they had no way of even knowing this stuff. God even told them how to go to the bathroom, right? Like he's like, go to the outskirts of the town and dig a hole, and bury it. We don't want that. You know what other civilizations did? They had raw sewage flowing right through the middle of town. Like everybody's just in there like doing their thing. I don't know, disgusting. We think, wow, that's so barbaric. But not the Jewish nation. That's not what they were doing. They were going on the outskirts of town. Why? To prevent disease and contamination. Thousands of years before we even knew that this was a thing. There's parts of scripture that told them how to use charcoal for uses of water purification. This wasn't something that was discovered until 1776. And all of us, we accept the unseen world as a fact, even though most of us have never seen it. Maybe you've looked through a microscope, but most of us have never seen the unseen world. Did you know that human eyes have never seen an atom before? Anytime you see an atom, like a drawing, that's simply an artist's rendering of what we think it might look like. Yeah, we know it's there, but we don't know exactly what it looks like. But we take it by faith because we've seen the effects of it. So we take these certain things by faith, and yet we say, well, there is no God, right? We find it very easy to believe in some things that are unseen, but other things that are unseen, we discredit them entirely. See in your notes, our God is a creator of the seen and of the unseen. Think about the power contained in an atom. The power contained in an atom can power cities, can destroy cities. Where do you think that energy and power comes from? And the tiniest thing that we can think of, an atom, where does the power come from? It says in Colossians 1 verse 15, it says, Christ is the visible image of a visible God. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. For through him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things that we can see and also the things that we can't see, such as thrones and kingdoms and rulers and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. And he existed before everything else. And underline this, and he holds all creation together. He holds it all together. All these cells in our bodies, like what holds them all together? What holds us all together? What holds all these things together? Well, there's something called laminin, and it's this cell adhesion molecule. Maybe some of you have heard this, and it literally holds all of our cells together. The average human body has around 37 trillion of these laminin cells. I have a picture of kind of what it looks like. Isn't it interesting that when you look at it, it's kind of in the shape of a cross? This one molecule that holds everything together, when we view it under a microscope, it looks kind of like that. Is it a coincidence? I don't know. Maybe it's a coincidence. Is it a fingerprint? I don't know if it's a fingerprint of God or not. I don't entirely know. All I know is this, that God is holding everything together. And he knew from the very beginning of time, he knew that apart from God, we would ultimately be doomed. And it would only be through the sacrifice that Jesus paid on the cross that could bring us together, and that we could not survive without his divine intervention. So do you think that we're here just by mistake? Think that we're here by coincidence? Like somehow we just magically won the cosmic lottery and ended up here? Somehow? No, God is holding us together. He's holding the very molecules in our body together. He's holding our lives together. He's holding the universe together. Imagine a God so big that he created the universe, and a God so intricate that he created atoms and molecules and eyeballs and brains. Imagine a God so smart that he gave us ways to prevent diseases from spreading long before we even knew it was a thing. Imagine a God who creates the vastness of space to the smallest particle, from this perfectly balanced home that we live in that you can set your watch by, to the intricacies of your body, that he made you and you're not a random clump of cells, that he made you, that he engineered you, that he designed you and he built you, and that you are his masterpiece, and he created you with a purpose, not just created you to take up space. See, that's the thing. No other ideology or theory can come up with the fact that we want a purpose. Like, I don't want to just exist, but I want to thrive. I want to live life to its fullest. I don't want to just be here, just feeding myself and then die one day. No, God has created us for so much more. So why do we have a hard time thinking that maybe God has also prepared an eternal home for us as well? After all he's done for us here, after all he's done for us, after all he's given us, don't you think he's engineered something amazing for us after as well? See, he is a God who is faithful and a God who is true. He is a God whom we can rely on, we can put our faith in, we can trust in him, and he will not let us down. If we call on his name, we will be saved. And he's a God who designed us, who made us, but he's also a God who loves us, who wants us as a part of his family, and that he's made a way for us to be made right with him through Jesus Christ.